Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
All right, so we are in Genesis chapter 41. God warns Pharaoh through dreams. And we are way back in the goody oldie days of 1886 BC at Egypt. So our reading is verses 25 through 36. And of course, helpfully, the reading left out a lot of the background information. So here's kind of the backstory. After Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden way before this, God set his redemptive plan to restore his blessing to humanity in motion. And the plan was that one of Eve's descendants would crush the head of the deceiving serpent. And this redemptive plan was to come through the line of Abraham and Sarah. Now, God was going to visit famine on Egypt. Here's the problem. The Egyptian famine would endanger the survival of the whole Mesopotamian world, which included Jacob, the then current line of Abraham and Sarah. That was kind of a problem that had to be solved, that God had another plan. This family line of Abraham and Sarah had to survive for God's redemptive plan to be able to play out, because it hadn't yet. So for both plans to execute, Abraham's grandson Joseph needed to be at the right place at the right time to be able, Joseph needed to be at the right place at the right time in Egypt and with access to Pharaoh to be able to interpret Pharaoh's dream, in which God told Pharaoh what he needed to do to survive the famine that was going to come. Well, how did God arrange this? Jacob had 12 sons. Joseph, Jacob's favorite, had provoked his brothers by prophesying that Joseph would rule over the 11 brothers. So, what did the brothers do? Well, of course, they sold Joseph into slavery. That's, the natural reaction to hearing your brother's going to rule over you. So, poor Joseph. Oh, good grief. He's kind of like John. He has a lot of bad things happen. But Joseph's woes didn't end there, being sold into slavery in Egypt, because Joseph still wasn't quite yet in the place that he needed to be for God's plan about the redemption to take place. So Joseph was falsely accused, and for some reason I'm thinking he was falsely accused of sexual assault, but at any rate, he was tossed into Egyptian prison. So while Joseph was in prison, he met Pharaoh's baker and cupbearer, because that's where the royal court tends to hang out, is in prison. But at any rate, two of Pharaoh's main servants were in prison just conveniently when Joseph got thrown in the clink falsely. But all three of these fellows were imprisoned: Joseph and the cupbearer and the baker. Now, both of these fellow inmates, the cupbearer and the baker of Pharaoh, had dreams that they couldn't understand. Joseph interpreted their dreams, and the only thing Joseph asked in return was that the cupbearer, who he had prophesied would return to Pharaoh's service, remember Joseph upon the cupbearer's release from prison. Now, naturally, the cupbearer forgot all about Joseph until Pharaoh had a dream that neither the Pharaoh or his advisors could interpret. So that's where we kind of pick up here. We start with God's revelation. Also, kind of a backstory to put this in context. The ancient Egyptians put great stock in dreams. They believed that their gods with the little g, communicated with them primarily through dreams that included supernatural elements. And dream interpretation was so valued that they wrote books, or scrolls, I guess, at that time, that were that helped them decipher the meaning of each dream component. And for example, there was a document called Papyrus Chester Beatty III. I assume that's probably who discovered it. But at any rate, this document dated back to the 13th century BC, and it could have been any older than that if he had copied it from something even earlier. But this document contained a list of dream components classified them as good or bad, and had possible meanings of each component. But here in Genesis 41, which is actually our reading for today, Pharaoh's advisors were stumped as to what Pharaoh's dream meant, which is when Pharaoh's restored cupbearer remembered, hey, there was this dude in prison. His name was Joseph. Let's see if he can figure it out, because he figured out our dreams. So enter Joseph. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God hath shewed Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 kine are 7 years, and the 7 good years are 7 years, and the dream is one. Welcome back to high school Shakespeare. So, here we go. Joseph makes clear that Pharaoh's dream is not from the Egyptian gods, again, little g, as might be expected, because Pharaoh was Egyptian. Pharaoh's dream was from the one true God. And I kind of wondered if maybe the reason the dream was not interpretable by Pharaoh's advisors is they were also Egyptian. This isn't an Egyptian god. And maybe it required one of God's own, Joseph, to interpret it. I don't know that there's any basis for that, but that was just a thought that flitted through my mind about 5:30 this morning. But Joseph goes on to explain that Pharaoh's 2 dreams are actually one dream because they have the same meaning. Joseph explained that God had sent Pharaoh the dream to reveal something big about God, big G, his plans for Egypt's immediate future. If you see in verse 25, where it says what he is about to do, that's emphasizing the important part of God's coming act and the dream that was revealed. It wasn't so much that God had revealed something to Pharaoh, the important thing was what God was going to be doing in Egypt. Not Israel, Egypt. Now, when you get down to verse 26, when it says there are seven good kine, K-I-N-E. I'd look that one up because I had no clue. Cows. Kine are cows. Now, you've got the word 7 here a few times. 7 good kine, 7 good years, 7 years. As Scott reminds us a lot, numbers are pretty meaningful in the Bible. And number 7 means
complete.
Represents completion, perfection, and spiritual wholeness. So I think that's important here. Get the next, there we go. And the 7 thin and ill-favored kine that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blasted with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. Again, welcome to high school Shakespeare. All right, so what in the world does that mean? The Pharaoh's dream had involved 2 sets of cows and 2 sets of 7 ears of wheat. The first set of 7 cows and the first set of 7 ears of wheat were fat, and the second set of cows and ears of wheat was thin. The second thin set ate the first fat set. I'm assuming the cows eating the ears of wheat, not the cows eating other cows, but at any rate, the thin set ate the fat set without getting any fatter.
No, it was cows eating cows.
Cows eating cows, okay.
Yeah.
Apparently it got more interesting than what I was reading. Okay. So Pharaoh had called the fat ears of wheat good and the thin cows poor, or bad or evil. And given the Egyptian proclivity to categorize their dream elements, as I said, as good or bad, as in that document that had been found, that might have meant that Pharaoh recognized that the first sets, the fat set, as good omens, and the second set, the thin ones, as bad omens. So at any rate, Joseph explains the sets of 7 each represented 7 years. Since the 2 dreams were actually one doubled dream, that meant the cow and wheat years represented the same 2 7-year stretches. The good set of cows and wheat years represented 7 productive years for the land, and the bad sets represented 7 years of famine. This interpretation likely made sense to the Egyptians, as cows and wheat were 2 of their most important food resources, and famine would predictably result in fat cows and wheat ears turning thin. So they didn't really question that. All right, so this is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. Behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. In verse 28 here, we see Joseph repeating the interpretation to Pharaoh a second time in language very similar to how he had given the interpretation back in verse 25 the first time. And that emphasizes that God had revealed to Pharaoh something God was going to do very soon in Egypt, as in God, capital G, God's doing, not the Egyptian fertility gods, little g, withdrawing their favor, because that's what the Egyptians tended to believe. When things were going well, it was because they had the favor of whatever God was over whatever it is they were talking about, and when things with that went poorly, it was the God over that particular thing withdrawing their favor. So, at any rate, in the second telling, Joseph went into greater detail for Pharaoh than he did the first time he said it. Probably because it was the first time he said it, going to take a few seconds to sink in that the Jewish God was interfering in Egypt, and this wasn't anything of the Egyptian gods doing. In verse 29, Joseph tells Pharaoh the geographical extent of all of the years of plenty. He says it's going to be throughout all of Egypt. And then in verses 30 and 31 we see, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. And the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous. This wasn't going to be your ordinary famine, it was going to be a really bad one. In verses 30 and 31, we see the extent of the famine's devastation. Now, the horrible news was that the 7 years of famine were going to be so catastrophic that it was going to totally wipe out any evidence of the prior 7 years of plenty and be so bad they weren't even going to remember that they had just come off 7 years of really productive, really good food years. In verse 30, it's talking about consuming or destroying the land. And then 31, it reinforces it that it's going to be very grievous or very heavy. In the second telling, Joseph is emphasizing land, because you see that the word land repeatedly here. Why is that? Land, or the earth or ground, is a prominent theme throughout Genesis. God created and filled the earth. He gave Adam and Eve dominion over the earth, and he cursed the ground because of Adam's sin, and destroyed the earth because of rampant wickedness. So this emphasis on land and earth is not new in Genesis, because throughout Genesis we see God's plan to restore the land to its original purpose. God promised to never again destroy the entire earth by water. He's going to give Abraham's descendants a land that's going to be the focal point of his redemptive work. Receiving abundance from the earth was a sign of God's blessing, so the opposite, receiving little from the earth, was a sign of God's blessing being removed or absent. A little bit like the theory of the Egyptian gods, little g, but this time it was the Jewish God with his people. So, even though the land at issue here was Egyptian, not the promised land, Pharaoh's dream still highlights the land's continuing struggle to survive and produce under the sin's curse. In verse 32, we see doubling down. And for that, the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice, It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. This is what Joseph is telling Pharaoh. So in Genesis 41, we see a lot of stuff happening in pairs. We've got, and not before the reading, where our reading started, there are 2 years between the prisoner's dreams and Pharaoh's dreams. Pharaoh had actually two dreams, and there were actually one, but he received it in 2 dreams, meaning the same thing. Pharaoh's dreams were recounted twice. And Joseph's interpretation uses 2 key phrases twice. In verses 25 and 26, we see the dream as one, and in verses 25 and 28, we see what God is about to do he showeth Pharaoh. Now, again, numbers are kind of important in the Bible. Number 2 in the Bible symbolizes concepts of duality, and I think here witness, but also partnership and division. So this doubling peaks throughout Genesis 41. It peaks in verse 32. Joseph reveals that the doubling of Pharaoh's dream indicates the certainty and the immediacy of what God's about to do. It wasn't, well, God might do this, it might happen sometime. It's no, Joseph will know it is going to happen, and it's going to happen now or real soon. And by doubling his interpretation of those 2 key phrases that I just told you about, Joseph is mirroring Pharaoh's double dream, which implies the urgency of the situation even before Joseph is actually explicitly spelling that urgency out in verse 32. So in this way, Joseph's helping Pharaoh see that Pharaoh had to take drastic action. And that's to prep Pharaoh for the drastic suggestion that Joseph is about to make to Pharaoh about how Pharaoh should tackle this problem. You got to remember, Joseph to Pharaoh in Egypt is a nobody. Yeah, he's a Jew. He's not one of them. You know, I think they just pulled him out of prison to see if he could interpret the dream. So he is like less than nobody, and Pharaoh is the top of the chain of authority over the entire nation. All right, so we go on to Joseph's wisdom. Now therefore, let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, for the first part of verse 34. So for the rest of the reading, this land theme continues. And instead of continuing in his warning, Joseph transitions to a 2-step, here you go, choose again, course of action that would spare the land from the coming famine devastation. In verse 33, we see step 1. Pharaoh appoints a bunch of overseers, including a right-hand man. That's what Joseph tells him very politely and maybe indirectly what Pharaoh needs to do to get through this. So he's saying overseers, and over the overseers you have a boss, a right-hand man that's subordinate only to Pharaoh. Kind of like the viziers in a later Egyptian dynasty, because the second command is second only to Pharaoh, and the viziers under that latter dynasty, that system, took on most of the responsibility for governing Egypt. Now, Joseph in here recommends that Pharaoh appoint a discreet and wise man to be the second command to carry out the rest of the plan that's Joseph's about to lay on Pharaoh. A little bit of an irony here, and maybe an even better reason for Joseph's sort of indirectness, because you would think that Pharaoh's leading advisors would be wise and discreet, and that would be who he would appoint. But these his advisors, who were supposedly so wise, hadn't been able to figure out how to interpret Pharaoh's dream, let alone come up with a solution. And here stands lowly Joseph, who's like at the bottom of the command food chain, or the societal structure there, because He's just a foreign nobody prisoner to them. And that's who figured out the dream. That's who's kind of coaching Pharaoh. Here's how you get yourself out of this. Here's how you survive. And so Joseph standing there, he's doing both. So clearly he is actually the most qualified of all these folks in the room to execute this plan that he's figured out. Now, even though it's not in a reading, Pharaoh does recognize and does just that and appoints Joseph as the second command, I guess as the food or famines are, we properly call them right now, later on in Genesis 41. But Pharaoh's immediate recognition of Joseph's superior qualifications over his own trusted advisors that he knew and he had been relying on, and he goes with, who to him is a nobody, demonstrates God's ability to show God's strength through human weakness, being Joseph's weak and impossible circumstances. Again, somebody in a foreign land who had been in prison. So through God's strength, Joseph was really bizarrely elevated in station and responsibilities in the blink of an eye, because that's not something a strong, confident leader generally does, is go tell his trusted advisor who he's relied upon and he knows real well, you guys step aside. I'm appointing this nobody that, I don't know who he is. He's not got a track record with me other than, he did figure out this dream that you yahoos couldn't figure out, and he came up with a really good plan. So the rest of verse 34, and Joseph's telling Pharaoh, after he appoints these overseers in the second command, says, and take up the fifth part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. So again, part 2 of Joseph's plan, the overseer's job is going to be to collect a portion of the land's abundance during this preceding 7 years of plenty, to store it away and guard it until the 7 years of famine came, so they'd have something to eat and wouldn't starve to death, literally. Now, take up the fifth part of the land. This part here. That's kind of subject to interpretation. Now, could be take 1/5 or 20% of the land's grain as a tax during the 7 years of plenty. Well, that sounds pretty good to begin with. Is it an idiom generally referring to organizing a land's crops? Maybe. Now, the verb that was translated into take up the fifth part is the verb form of the number 5, but it's also sometimes used in a military context to refer to the organization of ranks. So what does this take up the fifth part of the land mean? Good question. 5 in the Bible. 5 most often symbolizes God's grace, goodness, and favor towards humanity. Now, the interpretation of the 1/5 problem, it's unlikely that 20% of the grain during the 7 years of plenty would be enough to feed both Egypt and the surrounding nations during that following 7 years of famine. Okay, so maybe that's not it. It also seems to conflict with the directive that follows later on in Genesis 41 to collect all the food of the good years, possibly meaning all the food that the people didn't actually really need in the 7 years of plenty. Maybe. With the military context interpretation, here's the problem. Genesis 41 is not set in a military environment. It's not a military story. So, here's a possible solution. Not to take 1/5 or 20%, but rather to divide it into 5 parts, which would be consistent with the meaning sometimes associated with the verb form of other numbers. Now, if that's correct, That's the correct interpretation. It could mean that whatever grain the overseers gathered would be divided between 5 locations or something called store cities. And store cities were common in the ancient world. And that actually does seem to me to be the most likely interpretation, because they would be distribution centers, or they were guarding against some other unknown further threat against the food supply or storage. So I kind of agree with that one. I think the store cities is probably the most likely interpretation of that. So take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt. I think they would have distributed that food around, because times were going to, even though they had prepared, times were going to be lean enough, and they could not, if you put all of your supplies in one single location, for preparedness, that's known as not a really great idea. You need to separate things out a little bit, so if maybe your enemy comes and conquers one area, you don't lose all your stuff. If you get raided, you don't lose all your stuff if you have it divvied out instead of in one area. If they had like a bug infestation, or locusts, something like that, you're not going to lose everything that you've got all stored in one spot, because at that point they would have starved. If anything had happened to what little they had managed to hold back to get them through that 7 years of lean, anything happened to that, they would be completely done. So this is distributing the risk. All right, verse 35. And let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Again, that kind of sounds like we're more on the right track there. And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. Okay, well, here we see Joseph's recommended plan would alleviate the famine problem not only for the Egyptians, it would save the nation, and by extension, people from all the surrounding nations in the Mesopotamian region. Most importantly, for God's redemptive plan, that would include Joseph's own family in Canaan. Through Joseph's enslavement and imprisonment in Egypt, God had provided a way for his chosen family, and therefore the lineage of the coming Savior, to survive. So this doesn't seem so important for the non-Egyptians, but even we benefited. Because if Jacob's family had perished in a famine, we wouldn't have had Jesus. Kind of would have been a problem for us, huh? All right. The squirrel here's nibbling on a nut, and they're squirreling stuff away, so this seemed really relevant for this week's lesson. All right, so what do we get out of this? God knows everything and can share that knowledge with people, not just his chosen people. And God prepares for the protection for his people. You gotta figure, that was a pretty complex plan with a lot of moving parts, with a lot of people, with a multinational. And natural disasters like famines show that the earth still suffers under the curse of sin. And when God determines to do something, it is going to happen. No doubt about it. God expects us not only to trust him, but also to use practical wisdom amid trials. So, while God's going to provide, he doesn't expect us to sit on our duffs and go, oh, well, we don't have to worry about it. God's going to provide. We don't have to do anything. We're going to be all good. I think he's going to be a little angry with us if we do that. He expects us to try to help ourselves, to try to figure things out while we're trusting that he will provide a way. And hopefully he pops a good idea or two in our little pea brains on how to help execute that. God's given humans the responsibility of caring for the earth. And natural disasters are a good opportunity for us as Christians to display both the wisdom and the love of Christ, to figure out how to get ourselves through it and how to help others get through it. That's all I got.
So I think, this fifth is unusual, because you have to ask, well, did they only use a fifth of their natural resources to survive at the time? Okay, someone had to know that from Joseph come up with that number, right? 1/5. Or you have to manage that 1/5, and 1/5, is it gonna, if you take 1/5 and put it in the first year, is it gonna be good the 7th year, right? Or maybe the second year you take 2/5, right? And you divvy up back the first fifth. And the third year you take 3/5, okay?
You do a rotation system?
Yeah, with a rotation system, so it retains good, and you divvy up 1/5 of it the next year until you buy up the 7/5, right?
Yeah.
Or the,
Yeah,
because you'd have 7/5 at the end of it, so
yeah.
you'd have more than 1/5 to begin with. So it's interesting how you'd manage that.
Yeah, I think that the 1/5 is probably not literally meaning 20%, which you kind of think about that, at first read through. But I definitely bought more the interpretation of whatever they did gather up out of the 7 years of plenty that they had distributed around in different areas to help additionally safeguard it. Because that is definitely a tenet of preparedness, is you don't squirrel all your stuff in one spot.
So I think when it says plentifulness, that they had an abundance, that they sold off and done different things, that the 1/5 sustains them for a period of time, okay, for that 1 year.
Well, they probably did figure out that rotational system. I definitely agree with that. Because again, when you're swirling away supplies for preparedness, if it's something that you're consuming that may not last forever, because depending on how you store grain, it's going to last longer in the grain form than it will if you convert it to flour or anything like that. But it still does have an end date. And even grain is only going to last so long before it goes bad, or it's going to, again, you run the risk of drawing rodents with the grain. And if you get a rodent in your grain, you may lose your whole stock of grain, or at least a debilitating portion of it. So.
What was it in the Old Testament? You harvest your crop for 6 years, and the 7th year you didn't plant. Right?
You lay fallow, yeah.
To let the earth recover.
Yeah, so you let it recover. And that's also why you rotate your crops in different fields, and you plant different crop. You don't plant the same crop in the same place all the time. So, all right, anything else?
When I see this, God is the God who was, who is, and is to come. The is, you can talk about in your days of plenty, dispersing your plentifulness, or saving it for those rainy days.
Mm-hmm.
But instead of going out and buying a new car just because I want one, not because I need one.
Mm-hmm. Because you can.
Yeah, there you go. But you were talking about doubles, and everything's happened once, and everything's going to happen again.
Uh-huh.
So 7 years. That reminds us of what's to come.
Mm-hmm.
And I honestly see that there's going to be 3.5 years of plenty, because if you want to let people corrupt themselves, what do you give them?
Everything they want.
Yeah.
And then some.
So during that first 3.5 years, is this a guidance for us to stockpile, to save, to prepare for the 3.5 years of bowls of wrath, breaking of the seals,
Mhm.
and the 7 trumpets.
Well, it happened once, and we're idiots if we don't think it's gonna happen again.
But that's probably the most powerful thing I've gotten out of this.
Mhm. I like that.
I think it's really important too that we really listen for what the Holy Spirit says, because that was a specific number that was given to Joseph.
Mhm.
And like, I know there are times whenever I really know that I know that I know that I've heard God. He's very specific, and he always directs with specific numbers on what to do. And I think it's important that when we hear that and we know it's God, that we're obedient to that to the T,
Mhm.
because he knows the end from the beginning. So if anyone's going to guide us through anything, it's going to be him.
Yeah, and if God takes the time and effort to be so specific, there's a reason for that.
Right.
Anybody else? Okey doke. Well, thank you very much.